The church typically has a serious lack of commitment, at least in my opinion. Why is that so? We have this phenomenal message to bring to the world, but it seems like we lack a commitment that matches the message. If you're watching on YouTube and you're with a group, even if you're by yourself, you might want to just pause at this point and answer that question. Why do you think that the church normally lacks the kind of commitment we should have? Well, maybe we haven't really thought through why we should be committed to the Lord. And so here's the guiding question that we're going to have in this particular study right now. Why should you be committed to God? We are often saying, yes, we should be committed, but why? What reasons can you give to be a dedicated, a loyal, devoted follower of the Lord? Could you give several reasons? This is the question we're going to be addressing today in the book of Esther. The background here is that the people should never give up. They should make sure that they are continually following the Lord. And it raises the issue of those who were outside of the land of Israel. We focused mostly on the commitment of those that were in the land of Israel. But the book of Esther gives us another aspect of the whole picture because, frankly, the great majority of Jews were not in Israel during the post-exilic era. Does God really care about those that were left behind? Those who actually didn't go back to the land? Because we know that most of the Jews never returned to the land of Israel, even in the post-exilic era. We saw in Ezra that only 50,000 people came back, whereas one millennium earlier, there were actually 10 times that, much more than that, 600,000 warriors. It seems like obviously most of the people were actually living outside the land, and they stayed outside the land. We saw under Haggai and Zechariah and the book of Ezra, the first 6 chapters at least, we saw that God was faithful to help the people listen to these 2 prophets of Haggai and Zechariah and rebuild the temple. They did it. God was pleased. And that was how the Lord was working with those who went to Israel. But what about those who stayed behind? That's where the book of Esther fits in because it takes place in a 10-year period from 483 to 473 BC. We will see after that, the account will continue with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi, but we will address in those books. The kings have gone from Cyrus to Darius, and as we get into the book of Esther, we'll see that Xerxes is the king. Xerxes is the focus. And after him, Artaxerxes. But Xerxes is the main king in this book of Esther. The Persian Empire was, as noted previously, one vast, vast empire, stretching all the way over to Libya and Ethiopia and Macedonia in the west, and then all the way to India in the east. It was said in Esther chapter 1 that it went from India to Ethiopia. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, Esther 1:1 says. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Cush. Cush is the ancient name of Ethiopia. And this was a vast kingdom, larger than any other at that time. And we're actually putting the account of the book of Esther in between Ezra chapter 6 and 7. Because there's a 58-year gap there between the time of Zerubbabel, where the temple was rebuilt, to Ezra coming on the scene and teaching the people and leading a revival of the people in Ezra 7 and following. So we've come to Esther. Esther. You get it? Esther? Yeah. All right. And in the book of Esther, we find an extermination plot that is foiled. We will see in this book how the plot was planned to kill all of the Jews throughout the entire Persian Empire, and how God worked to foil that whole plan and turn those who were seeking the destruction of the Jews, turn them on their heads. So we go from threat to triumph, actually, in this book. The book focuses on a woman, as we saw in the book of Ruth. And what a great thing for God to include a couple of books like that in the Scripture that highlights women of God who gave of themselves, self-sacrificing themselves for the good of God's people, and God used them in a tremendous way. Interesting thing is, in this book, it goes on for 10 chapters, and in those 10 chapters, the name of God is mentioned how many times? Not even one time. Not even one time. In fact, the book of Esther not only doesn't mention God, it doesn't really mention anything spiritual. There's no mention of prayer. There's no mention of sacrifices. There's no mention of the temple. There's no mention of worship. In fact, so much so that some people have said in the past, this book is not really worthy of being in the Bible. I mean, after all, it doesn't mention God. But they said the same thing about Song of Songs. It also doesn't mention God. And yet, who could read Song of Songs or the book of Esther and see God working so wonderfully in a human relationship in Song of Songs or in a grand scale in the book of Esther and say that God was not involved in it? So I'm keeping this word providence as our key word for the book of Esther. You may not see God's name in it, but God's hand appears over and over and over in this book. It's all over the place. God may appear silent, but He's very much involved, even as is the case in your life and mine. Let me ask you, have you ever heard God speak to you audibly? I think most of us would say, well, He hasn't really done that for me. But does that mean God's not working in your life? Of course He's working in your life. But He doesn't have to get His name out there. He doesn't have to say the words out loud for us to actually know that He's working in our lives. But we have a responsibility. And that's where the key verse of the book of Esther comes into play. Because it's actually what Mordecai, Esther's uncle, says to her at the great time of crisis in her life, where she has to make a decision to risk her life on behalf of God's people. This is what he says. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you've come to royal position for such a time as this. Mordecai is saying to Esther, God put you in the place where you are at as queen because it was all part of His strategic plan. Are you going to act on that? That's really the message of the book of Esther. She was put there for such a time as this, a time when she should have a particular role in the plan of God. In fact, the word Esther is the Persian name from the Persian word for star. Well, indeed, she is the star of the book. The meaning is fitting because she's the star of this book that bears her name, and it's appropriate to call her Esther more than her Hebrew name Hadassah, which means myrtle or myrtle tree, even though that's a wonderful name as well. The book really doesn't call her by that name. And here's how I would sum up the whole message of the book of Esther. An extermination plot of the Jewish nation, plotted by Haman, reverts upon his own head through God's providence, through Mordecai and Esther, to encourage post-exilic Israel of God's continued commitment to the Abrahamic covenant. God has not forgotten his promises. He knows what he said in the past, and he knows how to get it fulfilled. And certainly, you cannot have the entire Jewish race wiped out and God still fulfill his promise to Abraham, because that included the blessing to the whole Jewish nation and through them to the whole world. So we have an extermination plot foiled in this book. We see, first of all, in the first 4 chapters, how the plot was planned. There was a threat to their lives. And then the story unfolds to show us, in the remaining 6 chapters, how the plot was foiled and the triumph of the Jews was actually the result. So back to our question. Why should you be committed to God? What reasons can you give to be dedicated and loyal and devoted to the Lord? That's our guiding question for this book. And we're going to get 2 answers to this question in the book of Esther. Here's the first one. Why be committed to God? Because, well, God's work faces threats. The Lord wants us to be committed because Satan is always trying to push down whatever the Lord is trying to raise up. And it's through the means of God's people doing God's will, committed to Him, that we are actually fighting back the enemy. You know, God commands our wholehearted devotion as we face many obstacles actually that are against His plan. And yes, He Himself is the one who's responsible for it all, but He uses people. And He uses those who are committed to what He has in store when the threat comes our way. We see this coming to play as we get on into the book. We find in chapters 1 to 4, Haman's plot to exterminate the Jewish people becomes known to Mordecai and Esther, whom God has strategically placed to inform Israel that apart from God, it could not exist as a nation. God was working behind the scenes to protect His people, putting people in the right place. And frankly, not only in the book of Esther has He been doing that, but He's been doing that all through history. The book of Esther is just one example of how He did that. And we will see after that Haman's extermination plot reverts upon his own head through God's providential workings to encourage post-exilic Israel of God's continued commitment to the Abrahamic covenant. This would have been a great encouragement to the people who had not made their way back to the land and needed to see God working His will in their lives. And what a great encouragement the book of Esther would have been. It starts with confusion. It starts with confusion even over who's to be the wife of the king. It got that bad. Xerxes was the king over this vast domain. And yet he found that when he sought to even embarrass his own wife, that he didn't have command even over his own wife. And so he divorced his wife Vashti, who refused to come before him and his nobles. And that caused in chapter 2 the need for a replacement for Vashti. And so what they did is they had a beauty contest that would take the most beautiful women throughout the land. And they would be there to pose and have all these treatments to become quite beautiful. Yes, like that. And this beauty contest was perhaps like many beauty contests today, not fair, because people have their certain people that they favor. And that was the case of Esther, who found favor in the eyes of the one who was in charge of this particular contest. We find that through all of it, these women, it was more than a beauty contest. They would actually go and visit the king in the evening and then return back to the harem in the morning. So it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to see what might have happened during the night. Esther had not revealed her family background at this point, but Memucan, who was the one who was in charge of this whole contest or this whole process, he really was drawn to Esther and favorable toward her. And so we see that the king, of all the women, after these 12 months of the beauty contests, he chose Esther. Chapter 2, verse 17 says, "Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. And so he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti." Now, we might ask the question, did Esther act honorably to go and spend a night with the king? Well, she acted honorably by following the advice of her uncle. She acted honorably by following the advice of those who were in charge of the whole contest. She showed a really submitted spirit to them and to God by doing everything that they said. She was not a strong-willed woman. She was willing to do whatever would be in the best interest of her nation. We don't see her actually acting on her own, in her own interest. We see her actually quite submissive to those in authority over her. The text doesn't seem to indicate that she acted dishonorably, considering the situation she was put into. In any case, she became queen. And the confusion subsided at that point. But other issues came up. At the end of chapter 2, we see that Mordecai was placed in a strategic place where he heard two men plotting the king's life. And Mordecai brought this information to the proper authorities, and these men were actually executed, and the king's life was spared. But it was all forgotten. It was recorded in the annals of the king, as we see at the end of chapter 2, but that was about all. And then we have another plot coming about in chapter 3. Mordecai refused to bow before Haman, one of the king's main royal officials. Why he didn't, it doesn't really say. But all the king's officials, chapter 3, verse 2 says, knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him, but Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Now, when you think about it, Mordecai is actually putting his life in danger. He has just spared the life of the king, but now Mordecai is putting his own life in danger by not bowing before Haman. And so he incurs not only the wrath of King Xerxes, but Mordecai not only incurs the wrath of Haman, but all the Jews become the target of Haman. He learns that Mordecai was a Jew, and he doesn't want to just kill Mordecai. He wants to kill all of his people. Of course, Haman doesn't realize that Queen Esther is a Jewess, and that thickens the plot a bit here. So Mordecai continues sitting down. And you know, when a man is very focused on himself, very arrogant, to not be given the honor that he thinks he deserves is actually quite a serious matter. And so we see in chapter 4 that courage and this conspiracy has to be followed by courage here. We're still in the grave danger part. How is it that she has to show great courage? Well, when Haman devises a plot to kill not only Mordecai, but all of the Jews, that becomes obviously a big problem for Esther's life, as well as for all the Jews and Mordecai throughout the entire Persian Empire. And so we see in this chapter here that Esther's put in a really, really important role, and she has to make that key decision. Thus we have that chapter 4, verse 14 to be the key verse of the book. But it raises the question again for us, why should you be committed to God? We see in this book that God's work faces threats. This is one example, and of course you can give examples in your own life of how God's work faces threats. But why should we be committed to God? Not only because God's work faces threats, but because God's work will ultimately triumph. God's work will ultimately succeed. The Lord will eventually be the victor, despite the fact that Satan is pushing us down. And that itself should be an encouragement for us to really be committed to the Lord. I think it's easier to be committed to the Lord, to God's plan, when we know that it will ultimately succeed. I mean, how many of us really want to be committed to something that we don't think is actually going to succeed in the end? And so Esther's put into that position where she needs to actually go to the king. Mordecai has said to her, "Don't you think you're put into royal position for such a time as this?" She ponders it, and she courageously goes to the king. She actually risked her life to go see her husband. You have to realize that this is a time of power and arrogance by Xerxes. And so, chapter 5 says that she put on her royal robe, stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. And when the king was sitting there in the royal throne, and he's facing the entrance, and he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her. And he held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king could have used that scepter actually to take Esther's life. He had not seen her for a month or so. He knew that she was risking her life to talk to him. And so when she came and she risked her life to come that close to him after not seeing him for a month, he knew that she had a very, very important matter on her heart. Well, Esther wisely did not explain to the king the situation at this point. She said, "If it pleases the king, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I've prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so we may do what Esther asks." And so they went to the banquet. It's quite a great story here. And we find that Haman, being arrogant that he was, feels tremendously honored, not only by the king, but by Queen Esther as well, to be at this banquet. And so he's so thrilled that he has honor that it really goes to his head. He enjoys the banquet, enjoys all of this, but the issue doesn't really come out regarding what was on Esther's heart. And so, as they were drinking wine, the king asked Esther, "What's your petition? It'll be given to you. What's your request? Even up to half my kingdom, it will be granted." And Esther said, "My petition and my request is this: if the king regards me with favor and it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to a banquet I will prepare for them. And then I'll answer the king's question." So all that happens at the banquet. And the next day, verse 9, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. Well, he was until he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence. He was filled with rage against Mordecai. And nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. So he called together all of his family and friends and boasted to them all that evening. Boy, I'm the only one the king really has a great honor for today. And besides that, there's a banquet tomorrow. I'm going to the banquet tomorrow. Just the king and queen and me. He's so full of himself. And his wife plays quite along with this as well. Maybe she was part of the problem. In verse 14, his wife Zeresh and all the friends said to him, have a gallows built 75 feet high, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it, and then go with the king to dinner and be happy. And this suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. Now think about that. 75 feet tall? A 7-story building? That is one tall gallows to hang someone, don't you think? And they had it built overnight? I could just see all of Haman's men out there with torches there, and all the wood they would have had to gather. This was a big, big project to complete overnight. But they did it. Haman was a man who had great authority, and so they had the gallows built. By the next morning, when we get into chapter 6, everything's ready to hang Mordecai. So Haman thought. Well, that night, chapter 6, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of his chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. Okay? What should you do if you're a king and you can't sleep? Well, I guess you've got such a boring reign that if you bring in the history of your kingdom, then probably that'll help you sleep. At least that's what he thought. It didn't work, though. It was found, recorded there, that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. So instead of the king actually being able to sleep better because of this reading, he woke up and he said, hey, what's been done for Mordecai? He saved my life. What have we actually done for him? Nothing's been done for him, his attendants answered. And that was evidently earlier on, or later on in the morning. And at that point, Haman ended up coming into the court to speak to the king, to request to hang Mordecai. Of course, Haman didn't realize that God's providential workings are all around this whole thing. And Haman has just been exalted in the eyes of the king. So Mordecai's come to do exactly the opposite of what the king already has in his heart about Mordecai. So they bring Haman in. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Well, you know, if you're full of arrogance, you tend to think that's yourself. Haman thought to himself, well, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. And let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. And let the robe, the man the king delights in to honor, let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead them on a horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what will be done for the man the king delights to honor. Haman's like, wow, it's going to happen to me, you know. Go at once. The king says, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. That's an order. Haman had no choice but to follow the order. I would love to have seen that. Haman marching out in front, Mordecai up on the horse. And Haman says, "This is what is to be done for the one the king desires to honor." And Mordecai, "I don't think they can hear you. You got to say a little bit louder, a little bit louder. This is what will be done for the one the king desires to honor." You lift up your head, Haman, please. I wonder what kind of interchange going on between those two guys. And of course, I don't mean to imply that Mordecai was arrogant about it. But Mordecai knew that Haman absolutely despised him. And Mordecai was beginning to see, yes, God's name is not mentioned anywhere here, but God's stamp is all over this whole situation. Well, Haman was just absolutely humiliated. He rushed home with his head covered in grief. And he told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. And what kind of consolation did they give? His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, from before your downfall started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." "Well, thanks a lot, sweetheart. I could imagine sending his wife." And while they're still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. You ever go to a banquet and you really didn't want to be there? A wedding banquet, a funeral, or whatever. Imagine Haman attending this banquet with a foreboding. And that's exactly what we have in Esther chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And as they were drinking wine on that second day, the king asked again, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half my kingdom, it will be granted." Here was Esther's answer. "If I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation." Really? Long pause. The king was confused. Somebody's trying to kill the queen? Well, who would do that? Verse 5. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Well, who is he? Where's the man who has dared to do such a thing?" "The adversary is this vile Haman," Esther says. Oh my. She certainly pointed at him. And Haman knew this was the end. Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in rage, left his wine, and went out to the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, would stay behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. And just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was fallen on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Oh, will he even molest the queen while she's with me in the house?" And as soon as the word left the king's mouth, it covered Haman's face. He's a goner. They covered his face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He made it for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." Very carefully chosen words, don't you think? Remember, Mordecai's the guy who saved your life, and here's an opportunity. Nobody's actually hanging on that gallows that's built for this kind of thing. Hang him on it, the king said. And so they hanged Haman on the gallows he prepared for Mordecai. And then the king's anger subsided. Think of the courage that it took for Esther to confront this situation. What a tremendous woman of God who would actually go and risk her life and plan this so well. Of course, God had his hand in the whole thing because God's the one that gave the king insomnia. As we get to chapter 8, we see the vindication. We see actually what happens on all this. Because Haman dies. He's out of the picture here. And that same day, chapter 8, verse 1 says, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king. For Esther had told him how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman. They took the ring off before they executed him. And he presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Well, Esther again pleaded with the king. Falling at his feet and weeping, she begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. And then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he's pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see the disaster fall on all my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? So they did it. The vindication to protect the Jews was another edict that allowed the Jews to actually protect themselves. And this text was copied. It was translated in the various languages of the 127 provinces and sent out on the king's fast horses, especially bred for such kinds of dispatches. And the edict was also issued in the citadel of Susa, verse 14 says. And in every province there was feasting and joy and celebration by all the Jews. So then, what happened? We don't find that until we get to chapter 9. In chapter 9, we see the victory. We see the fact that these people, acting courageously, being committed to do what God wanted them to do, ended up becoming victorious. And several months later, on the 13th day of the 12th month, in the month of Adar, chapter 9, verse 1 says, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. And on this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews in the cities, in their cities, and all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those, assembled to attack those seeking their destruction. And no one could stand against them. And all the nobles of the provinces and satraps and governors and kings and ministers helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai became very prominent in the palace, and his reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. So the Jews struck down all their enemies, and the slaughter was quite great. In fact, they also killed the 10 sons of Haman, lest these sons rise up as well and try to undo what God had actually done here. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. And when the word came to the king how many people were actually slain, he said that the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men. And the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa, what have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? The king underestimated the kind of antagonism there was toward the Jews in the province. Now, what's your petition? It'll be granted to you. What's your request? It will also be granted. And Esther said, if it pleases the king, let the Jews in Susa have permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also. Let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. And so that request was granted as well. So we see that they actually killed many thousands of people who were their enemies, who were intending to kill them. And in celebration of that, we have what is called the festival of Purim. Pur, P-U-R, is the word for lot. When you put an I-M ending on the end of it, it's pluralized. So Purim really means lots. And these lots had been cast to determine the day to kill the Jews. The lots actually were reversed so that the Jews ended up triumphant instead. Harper Bible's dictionary says in its article on Purim, it's a minor holiday of the Jewish calendar based on the account in the book of Esther. The holiday is preceded by the fast of Esther, commemorating the period of assembly and fasting before the deliverance. On Purim, according to Talmudic practice, the Megillah, the scroll of Esther, is read in the synagogue. Charity is distributed, gifts of food are exchanged, and the festive meal is eaten. It's basically as Proverbs 16:33 says. A lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. God was all over this whole story. And the story lives on now, each year, because Jewish children are involved in plays. Every festival of Purim, it's a goal for every boy to play Mordecai and a girl to play Esther and enact this story of how God saved their ancestors. Or if God had not, then they never would have been born in order to tell the story. So I call Purim lots of victory. Lots of victory. And it's a great day of fasting for Jews that is followed by feasting for Jews, recognizing that the fast turned to a feast. We actually have 10 banquets in the book of Esther, and it ends with this one, which is the banquet of all banquets. And the story ends in chapter 10, saying that Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire, and all of his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king had raised him. Well, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. Which is a reminder to us of hopefully what we already know, that all those who seek to fight against God's people, they're not just fighting against God's people, they're fighting against God himself. God had said in Genesis 12, verse 3, to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And all peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. We see an example of that here, where those who are fighting against God and God's promise are surely going to be defeated. And indeed, it happens time and again. It has happened throughout history. So back to our question, why should you be committed to God? We have seen that God's work faces threats. And many of us have faced those threats as believers. But we also see that not only does God's word face threats, but God's word will triumph. The question is whether we are really working in concert with God. Are we together with him in this? Especially as it relates to the welfare of the Jews. Put the two ideas together, and we really have a central thought for the book of Esther. A main idea. I would say it this way. Despite Satan's threats, God will triumph. Despite all the attacks of the enemy in our lives, and they are fierce, and they are life-threatening, and sometimes they do take the lives of those who love the Lord. Nevertheless, in the grand scheme, in the big picture of it all, God is going to triumph, despite the fact that we may really suffer for Him. So what to do? What should we do? How should we respond in all of this? Well, we should use the position that God has given us for His people. Use your providentially placed position to help God's people. How has God placed you in a significant role where you can help others, God's people? Here I'm talking about God's people. Yes, Jews. We certainly don't want to be people who persecute the Jews or any people. But what about those who honor the Lord? We should be representing God's people and living our lives to do all that we can for the benefit of God's people. What a sad thing to see when believers sometimes actually oppress other believers rather than using the power and authority and position they have to be a blessing to them. If you go to Iran today, you can visit Esther's tomb. She's honored there, and it's a reminder to those who live in Iran and those who visit the tomb that she was willing to be God's person, in God's place, in God's timing, to do what God wanted her to do. She's a reminder to us that we should be people who hold to those same priorities.